And I'm really honored to be giving this lecture today. I'm a little bit intimidated to be talking about the Pacific in front of people who know the Pacific much more deeply than I do. Hopefully I will do justice to some of the comments that have come up in the workshop so far and in some of the issues that have risen when I've had the opportunity to work in the Pacific. I know you know all about climate change. I'd like to show a few background slides just to make a couple of points about some issues that are important on the health side. And I'm going to start with a series of stills that I pulled out of a nice little video clip put together by NASA. For those of you who don't know, the climate community establishes 30-year periods and then as a baseline, and then looks at changes around that baseline. And most of the work that has been done on a changing climate has used a baseline of about 1961 to 90. So the ones I'm showing you are based on how was the world different in terms of temperature between the periods I'll show you and 1961 to 90. So in the upper right-hand side, you can see we're looking just after the start of the Industrial Revolution, when humans started pumping out greenhouse gases through deforestation and burning of fossil fuels. And up in the left-hand corner, you can see the relative temperature. So as you would expect, the temperatures right after the start of the Industrial Revolution were primarily much cooler than they were in 1961 to 90. This is 100 years after the previous slide. This is 10 years after the one before that, and this is 10 years again. And it shows a couple of things quite dramatically. One is the rate of change. So the rate of climate change right now is faster than it's been in more than 10,000 years. And rate is really important when we think about, for example, vector-borne diseases. This allows mosquitoes, ticks to change their range quite rapidly as the temperatures warm so quickly. It also shows you that warming is highly uneven. There's places that are warming more than others. Everyone knows the Arctic is warming more than most of the rest of the planet. A lot of people don't understand that there's other parts of the world that are warming almost as much. I work quite a bit in the Pacific. I also work in Africa. Parts of Africa are warming almost as much as the Arctic. This unevenness in the warming is really critical when we think about health. I think that climate change is going to really push the evolution of public health in a new direction. Public health is primarily a top-down activity. Public health is just great at going out and saying, we have a problem with lead, we've got a problem with cigarette exposure. We go out and we do studies to quantify how much exposure leads to how much of a response. We do those studies in a few places and we apply them everywhere. With a changing climate, our exposure is different everywhere, which has real consequences for how we think then about adapting, preparing individually, collectively, through our health systems to prepare for those changes. Following on that, I don't know if you all saw within the last couple days was the announcement that April was the 400th warmer than normal month in a row, based on the 20th century average. People often ask, how is it that there are folks who say the climate isn't changing despite the evidence in front of them? And there's lots of issues that are put forward. There's another explanation that may play a bit of a role in this that comes from concepts we use in public health. In public health, we often talk about cohorts, that people born during certain periods have different kinds of exposures. And so we do lots of cohort studies to see how things differ over these different time periods. So when you think back, what was 400 months ago? It was quite a long time ago. But basically it means the students that I'm teaching were born and raised during a time when the climate has never been stable. Most of us are older than my students. I often ask, how many people are older than were born before or after about 1980? And people don't actually want to admit that. They often answer other questions, but not that one. But those of us who are older than that were born and raised in a time where the climate was relatively stable. So this might be a particularly hot year, but it will go back to a normal. So I certainly was raised during a time when temperatures varied quite a bit, precipitation varied quite a bit, but it always settled back to this average. But it's for younger people where it's not ever settling back to an average, it's just changing all the time. So there's different expectations, different experiences. We've got different cohorts experiencing climate change with different sets of expectations about what that means based on how we've internalized weather and climate as we grew up. Where are we going? You've all seen projections. The top row are changes in average surface temperature under really low emissions. The one on the left, we've got a chance, if we're under really low emissions, to keep global surface temperature change certainly below 2 degrees, maybe below 1.5 degrees, the two temperature goals in Paris Agreement. And on the right, a high emission pathway, which is unfortunately where we're at right now. On the bottom is precipitation. So the changes you can see are quite large. If we continue with high emissions, in the upper right-hand corner, the changes in temperatures are 6 degrees centigrade, with quite a large range around that because there's a large range of uncertainty. And 6 degrees may not sound like a lot, but the difference in average surface temperature between now and the last ice age is about the same magnitude. So it's thinking about changing the planet on the same magnitude as between now and the last ice age, obviously in the opposite direction, and doing it in 100 years, not in 100,000 or more years. So again, rate is really important. And so what we're seeing taking place is real shifts in species. We're seeing shifts in basic weather properties in certain areas. And so we do have to think about what all that means for health. It's not just changes in the average, it's changes in the extremes. This is some work that was done for an IPCC report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters. And what Noah Diffenbaugh and his authors did was look at the period 1985 to 2005 and said for 26 world regions, what is the one hottest day? So for a lot of my students, what was the one hottest day when they were growing up? And then for these time periods, you can see under moderate emissions and high emissions for June, July, and August, or the virtual in the southern hemisphere, said how often could those temperatures occur in the future. As I said, we're under high emissions, and you can see in the tropics right now that those days that used to occur once every 20 years are happening almost every year. In some parts of the world, if we stay under high emissions, we're heading into a future where the coldest day in the summer in the future will be hotter than the hottest day today. Summers will be completely different from what they are now. Warmer air holds more water, so everything I just said then has implications for precipitation. In the US, we've seen a 20% increase in heavy precipitation events. We're not necessarily seeing more precipitation events. When it rains harder. So you're seeing lots of consequences from that, a lot more flooding. I live in Seattle. When we've got high tides now in Seattle and we have these heavy precipitation events, you see water spouts downtown coming up. There's apparently a Starbucks where it comes up regularly in front of one of the Starbucks, because with the high tide, it's just blocking the access of the water to go out into the Puget Sound. So these are having consequences. You hear me talking a lot about the extremes. Extremes are going to characterize all of our lives. And they're going to characterize our lives in lots of ways, small and large. They're going to affect everyone in lots of different ways. I gave a public talk not long ago, and I talked about this, and someone in the audience said that she had recently purchased a house. The house was over 100 years old. She'd purchased it 20-some years ago, and when she purchased it, the house had never flooded. And in the 20-some years she'd had it, it flooded 5 times. So there'll be small to large consequences everywhere. And when we look to the future, we're looking at risk. Risk is inherently uncertain. We don't know exactly what the future is going to bring. There's been a lot of focus on uncertainty in the climate models. There's lots of uncertainties in other spaces as well. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, spent quite a bit of time thinking about how to frame these issues in terms of what's going to likely happen with a changing climate, and came up with this nice summary figure saying that risk is composed of 3 basic factors. One is the hazards created by a changing climate. I've talked about a few of those. But it's not just the hazard. You could have massive flooding in a place where nobody lives, and it's not going to have any consequences. So we need to know exposure. We need to know who or what is exposed. And exposure varies a lot from place to place. The same strength typhoon has hit Japan and has hit the Philippines. Not the same typhoon, but the same strength typhoon. Very different consequences because the exposures are different. You've got different coastal hardening. You've got different infrastructure. There's all kinds of reasons why you can have different exposures. And the third is vulnerability varies from place to place. Some places have different kinds of vulnerabilities. When you look across the full range of concerns about a changing climate, you see a real mix of different kinds of vulnerabilities, and we need to understand that if we're going to be effective to take these risks into our planning processes so that we know what we need to plan for. We use our resources, our human and our financial resources, effectively. And I won't talk about the rest of it, but it's really important to think about how these 3 factors come together. So when we think about the health risks of a changing climate, we think about all aspects of this. And again, it's really important for how we think about adaptation. To underscore the vulnerability, this is my current favorite slide. If you have not found it, I highly recommend looking for it. It's from Doghouse Diaries. It's apparently data-driven. A group of people went out and asked, what does each country in the world lead in? What is it the best at? So in the US, we're best at Nobel laureates and being killed by lawnmowers. Canadians, maple syrup and asteroid impacts. I was in Brazil recently. They're very proud of the fact that they lead in FIFA World Cup titles. And you can look around, and these are really quite interesting. One you can't see here is the Netherlands leads the world in being tall. I don't know if you've been around any people from the Netherlands, but they are really tall. I was in an elevator recently with 2 very tall men speaking something that I knew was not really quite German. And one looked at me at some point and said, I bet you can't guess, where we're from. And I went, the Netherlands? They were really big. So it's really funny. It's fun to explore. And it really underscores everywhere has capacity and everywhere has vulnerability. And it's different. So going back to the comment I made before about how climate change and health is going to really push the evolution of public health, we have to take that into account. How we address the challenges we're facing will vary depending on our capacities. And how can we build on those capacities? We had some nice discussions today in our meeting about using the capacities across the Pacific to support all the countries instead of replicating unique capacities every place, particularly when you've got limited resources. Oh, I should have pointed out, we've got some folks here from Australia and New Zealand. So Australia leads in deadly animals and melanoma, and Alistair, sheep and rugby.
Quite true.
What's that?
Quite true.
Quite true, good. So why are we concerned about these issues of a changing climate for health? And I'll show just a couple of examples. Essentially, any health outcome that is seasonal could be affected by a changing climate, because many diseases are seasonal because of temperature precipitation. So this is a fairly old analysis, but it's a nice analysis across the Pacific, just showing the rate of diarrheal disease by temperature. When temperatures go up, many pathogens replicate faster. So if all else is equal, if it's warmer out, they're just going to grow faster and you can have more opportunities. There's other factors that are important here as well, understanding precipitation patterns, that there are many cases where heavy precipitation patterns increase diarrheal diseases because they wash pathogens into waterways. A good colleague of Julie and mine works on this issue. She used to have this great picture she took out of Field and Stream magazine that showed cows next to a stream. And the tagline was, "It's too bad cows don't fish because they live next to the best streams." And she would then go on and talk about pathogens washing into waterways. So there's several ways that a changing climate could affect diarrheal disease. You'll be happy I'm not going to take you through all of this, but it's an example for vector-borne diseases, particularly the mosquito that can carry Zika, dengue, and chikungunya. But temperature and precipitation, when I stand over here, things start making noises. I won't get too close. So temperature and precipitation interact with several factors that are really important for the survival, the replication of mosquitoes. So we know that mosquitoes, where we see them, when we see them, are affected by our weather. Flooding events also are important. This is an extensive analysis from the Solomon Islands showing how diarrheal disease, dengue cases, malaria change over the season. Again, anything that's seasonal may be affected by a changing climate. So we know a priori from analyses that have been done in many places that we would expect a changing climate to impact our health. There's also issues that are coming up on the horizon that people are starting to work on. The biggest concern in terms of health in the Pacific Islands are the non-communicable diseases, heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And there are ways that the drivers of these non-communicable diseases could be affected by climate change. And so there's more interest in trying to understand. We know that there are changes in the quality of our food from rising concentrations of carbon dioxide. We know that people's responses to things like disasters in terms of food choices can all affect obesity, can affect hypertension, can affect our overall health. So there's more work starting in this space, which will be very important for the Pacific. And this is a nice summary that was put together by Lachlan McIver and some work that he did in the Pacific, showing some factors of a changing climate, how it affects a range of adverse health outcomes, and some of the pathways for these. I won't go through all of this. We can talk about this later if you'd like to go into it in more detail. But people are putting together these summaries to say, what would we expect to happen based on our understanding of these adverse health outcomes? There was an analysis in 13 countries. There's a process called a vulnerability and adaptation assessment, which is really valuable for countries to identify how they might be vulnerable to a changing climate and what kind of options they have to manage those. And as you look across the countries, you can see all the countries are worried about water security and safety. Food security and safety just about everywhere, vector-borne diseases, respiratory illnesses. There's many issues that are common across the Pacific. It has to do with the location. So some of these diseases are just more common in the tropics. It has to do with weak health systems. It has to do with overall vulnerability. So there's lots of issues that the countries share. They don't share all of these issues everywhere, but there are lots of issues that can be addressed in regional approaches. Again, taking into consideration that each country is different, has different vulnerabilities and different capacities, but having similarities across the countries provides opportunities to work more closely across the countries to address them more effectively.
So Kris, why would Kiribati not have health impacts of extreme weather events, having been to Kiribati?
This was an assessment.
Highly vulnerable.
That's a very good question. These assessments were done by the countries, and they were done within ministries of health, and there is different relationships between ministries of health and ministries of the environment in different countries. And this assessment has to do with the concerns the Ministry of Health has. So some countries, disaster risk management is run by a completely different agency. And so, and I don't remember exactly for Kiribati, and I don't see the person here who can answer that question, but it could just be that the disaster risk management is in somebody else's bailiwick. But this is what they have to worry about. In some countries, food security is not within the Ministry of Health. It's how the ministry is set up. So worldwide, this is a nice slide that was put together by CDC. Shows you some of the concerns of a changing climate in terms of what we see changing in temperature, precipitation, which leads to different exposures that are important for health. And on the outside then shows you not a complete, but a nearly complete list of all the health concerns of a changing climate. And this is just about everything a Ministry of Health has to deal with. So climate change is cutting across ministries in unique ways. Ministries have programs for non-communicable diseases, for water security. As I said, some may or may not have food security as part of what they do in the ministry. They might have food safety, but they don't have food security. So thinking about how to address these challenges when you've got it as a cross-cutting theme. When issues are cross-cutting themes, it's nobody's particular responsibility. And how do you best manage then what we say mainstreaming this across a ministry in an issue that's new for most ministries that don't have the technical capacity, don't have the training, don't understand this as an issue. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring people up to speed. But this really gives you a sense of the magnitude of the challenges. The same assessment I showed you of the vulnerability and adaptation assessments came up with a list of priority adaptation options. And these are summaries. Underneath these are much longer lists of the kinds of adaptation options. So countries are beginning to work on what is it we need to do to adapt to a changing climate. How do we take our current policies and programs and bring climate change into them? On the one hand, as opposed to many of the other sectors, the health sector is really quite fortunate in that all of the health concerns of a changing climate are current problems. If you could control diarrheal disease today, it's not going to be a problem in 2100. The millions of children who die every year needlessly from diarrheal disease illustrates we're not doing it well today. So we've got a lot to build on. We've got policies and programs that have been in place for 100 years for some of these concerns. None of them were designed with climate change in mind. And so that's where the work is needed, of taking what we know about managing diarrheal disease, managing food safety, water safety, and then bringing climate change into that to make sure that these programs consider how climate change could change the geographic range, the seasonality, the intensity, and making sure that that information is updated on a regular basis as we understand more about the climate science. So that's a lot of where the focus is. There's a lot that needs to be done, and again, we're working on a really solid basis of knowledge. And now I wanted to get to the part where I talk a little bit about some of the silver linings. I hope there's some silver linings. I showed you the slide that I didn't go through on how temperature and precipitation can affect the geographic range of a mosquito called Aedes aegypti, also Aedes albopictus, that can carry dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and yellow fever. And this just shows from February of 2016 outbreaks of dengue. The red ones are dengue in most places, Zika. the Pacific has had regular outbreaks of these infectious diseases and continues to have regular outbreaks of these infectious diseases. So the first silver lining is there's been an enormous investment in collecting environmental information that by and large the health sector is not using. We've got tremendous opportunities to start developing more early warning systems. This is an example from Singapore where the red are the forecasted cases of dengue, the black are the reported cases, showing that this system that was set up, and this was set up for somebody during a PhD thesis, really matches really well. What you can't read is down here in the little tiny type, which is also cut off at the bottom of the slide, is the forecast is 16 weeks in advance. 4 months to go out and make a difference. This particular mosquito likes humans. It will fly a mile to bite a human over everybody else. If you're paranoid about mosquitoes, Aedes is a reason to be paranoid about mosquitoes. It lives around humans. It breeds in the water in the bottom of a flower pot. It's incredibly difficult to control because you have to clean up all the breeding sites. But if you've got 16 weeks, you can go out and do the public education campaigns. You can go out and make sure that people clean up the breeding sites. You can put out the information so that pregnant women protect themselves, that they don't get bitten. So there's a lot you can do when you have that kind of lead time. And so this is one of the silver linings, that, as I said, the sector is just not using this environmental information. It's there. We need to pick it up, we need to use it, and to do so would really protect health right now, even before we start taking climate change into account, because we're just not doing this. So there's an enormous opportunity to protect health by starting building these systems based on what we understand from the environmental side, and then bringing in the health data so that you know where and when to start deploying your resources. Another example is I worked on a part of a project in the country of Samoa, not American Samoa. And it's a long story, but basically they only had 2 years of digital health data. And at one point I was able to get a printout of the diarrheal disease data for 2 years. Very seasonal, really strong seasonality. And I went down the street to the meteorologist and said, would you plot rainfall on there? And the rains come, as you would expect, before the diarrheal disease cases. But the people in the ministry didn't know that. And just showing them the plot of here's the cases, here's the rainfall, and by the way, your meteorological services has pretty good skill in saying when the rainy season's going to start. So you can take your limited budget that you have for diarrheal disease and deploy it much more effectively. You're going to know when you need to go out and retrain all your healthcare providers. You're going to know when you need to put oral hydration in place. And so they started using that information. So there's a lot that we can do even in highly constrained situations. But this is a place that a priori, a bunch of us thought that Singapore would never be able to develop an early warning system. The Ministry of Health says that Singapore's got 3 seasons. It's hot, and really, really, really hot. It's hot, it's humid, it's a great environment for Aedes, and it didn't seem probable that you could see a signal in the noise of dengue cases when you've got that kind of environment. In fact, you do, which is terrific. Really, it provides a really great opportunity. Singapore's got the best dengue control program in the world, and they really struggle to control it. In Singapore, the civil authorities are allowed at any time to come into your living environment and check whether you've cleaned up breeding sites. And if you've not cleaned up breeding sites, you get very, very large fines, hundreds of dollars of fines, to make sure that people clean up breeding sites. They had a big outbreak a few years back. It went on for about a month, and they couldn't figure out where the mosquito was breeding. As I said, it breeds in these small amounts of water. And they kept going back and back and back into people's housing to try and figure out where the mosquito was breeding. People live in apartments, and they hang out their washing to dry. and they've got standpipes outside of their apartments, and Aedes was breeding in the pipe, in the condensation at the end of the pipe. Knowing that makes it a lot easier then for the next outbreak when you've got a forecast 4 months in advance of what you have to do to make sure that you don't have that water there. This is not from the Pacific, but it's such a great example. I wanted to put this in. In Europe, there's a big network. The European Center for Disease Prevention and Control has a very large data set that has health data and has environmental data. It's called the E3 network, European Environmental Epidemiologic Network. This is where there used to be malaria transmission in Greece before malaria was eradicated sometime in the 1950s. And then over the period of 2009 to 2012, there started to be locally caught cases of malaria. So the folks at the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control analyzed those cases of where are we seeing those locally caught cases, what are the environmental characteristics of those places. Then used that information to identify everywhere else in Greece with the same environmental characteristics. So we're seeing certain temperature, precipitation, elevation patterns here. We've got locally acquired cases where else looks just like that. And they use that for proactive spraying. They didn't see more cases. You'd never know if they would have seen more cases or not. But it's a great example of using environmental information to target your public health interventions. Instead of spraying everywhere for mosquitoes, we're just going to spray where we know we've got the kind of characteristics. It's an Anopheles mosquito that carries malaria. We're just going to spray where we need to. So it's these great examples of how we can use this information to be much more effective. This slide has been shown many times today. I put this in before I saw all the slides today. It's another really excellent example. 97, 98 was a major El Nino. And there was, for the first time, a really good forecast in the Pacific. And the Pacific ENSO Application Center developed a program, including, I think, the East-West Center. Was East-West Center involved? You don't think so? Eileen Shea, but
I think we were formal.
so this is, as you can see, Pohnpei, and there was lots of outreach done in the countries that will be affected. ENSO events occur every 2 to 7 years as an El Nino event, and part of the Pacific gets more precipitation than more normal, part gets drought. And Pohnpei is where you get drought. In fact, at the height of the El Nino, Pohnpei just had a few hours of running water every week. We know from lots of work done in public health, when you have less water, people use water differently. And they use it differently in a way that increases diarrheal diseases. People don't wash their hands when water is really precious. So there's a massive outreach so that people knew what they had to do, including boiling water. So you can see there's a billboard, there was a call-in number where people could call in and ask any questions that they had about the El Nino. And there was a jingle on the radio. And the person who led this, Eileen, likes to say that more people called in to the call-in number to find out how they could get the jingle on the radio because it was really cute. They all knew what to do, and diarrheal diseases went down. So this was a forecast several months in advance that was incredibly helpful for public health. We can replicate this in lots of other kinds of settings. This is not to say that the work that was done prevented all the adverse health outcomes. There's real problems with food security. There's problems with undernutrition. So there's very serious challenges that the work that was done didn't prevent. But it was also limited in terms of how much time, how much resources people had to invest in that kind of outreach. So again, opportunities for using this environmental information to make a real difference for health. So where are we going in the future? I showed you the temperature, precipitation projections, and here's just some for Kiribati that were put together for one of their national assessments of increases in temperature, big increase in heat waves, big increase in flood risks. Again, you can read this in multiple different ways. all of us present these kinds of data regularly. But to think about it is, here are some of the challenges we're going to have to start facing. How do we organize to do that? How do we have a trained workforce? How do we think about the infrastructure? What do we want to do with our housing? You have time to start planning if you take this information into account. I couldn't resist the temptation of putting this in, Nancy. Chiguatera is a real problem in the Pacific. There was a fairly recent analysis showing that Chiguatera is associated with warm sea surface temperatures with a lag at 18 months and with increased storm frequency. And a projection for if temperatures go up, a really big increase, and this is in the Caribbean in Chiguatera. But again, real opportunities for, if you've got that amount of time, there's a lot that you can do to be prepared. Public health is much more a reactionary in terms of environmental change. So we just wait for the outbreak and then we go out and we solve it. I keep hammering on this. We've got a chance to use this information so that we can be effective, efficient, and not have these outbreaks, which would be a great outcome. I've focused a lot on health, on how climate change can affect our health, our community health. It also affects our health systems. So this just shows you a little bit about what happened under Hurricane Winston. Enormous consequences for Fiji. This also shows you what's going on in the Solomon Islands when you've got king tides. You've already got healthcare facilities that are incredibly close. Here's the fence, there's the fence. So they're already seeing floodwaters come in, that's why buildings are raised. So we're seeing real consequences for the health systems themselves, for our infrastructure. There's many countries where you see heavy flooding events where healthcare personnel can't get to their job. So you have situations where people are working in a facility, you have a big event, the people who are working there can't leave, they can't go home and check on their families, you can't get new personnel in. It's very difficult to manage and very stressful for the healthcare providers. So there's a lot of work that we need to do around our health systems. And there's work that's being done on this. This is another example from Pohnpei, that the World Health Organization developed a hospital safety index that's being used for hospitals to assess what their vulnerabilities are and to take a look at what they need to do. So there's tools that are being developed to help hospitals plan more effectively. And then I wanted to talk about a second and different issue that also has a silver lining in it. And I wanted to introduce a concept that is used a lot within the scientific community, but it hasn't been used that much in communicating with the general public. And that's the whole idea of having a carbon budget. There's been a lot of work that's been done saying how much total carbon dioxide, or the equivalent thereof in terms of the other greenhouse gases, can humans put into the atmosphere to keep temperatures below 2 degrees C. So this is a carbon quota for a 66% chance of staying below 2 degrees C. And this is the total carbon budget. And this says these are non-CO2 gases, CO2 from past fossil fuels and industry, land use change. So this is how much of that carbon budget has already been used. And that's what's left. Because what you read in the newspapers is the annual concentration of CO2, but CO2 takes a long time to come to equilibrium in the atmosphere. What really matters is what is the total that's up there, and how much can we afford collectively to put into that atmosphere if we want to stay below 2 degrees C. And so you can see the total remaining budget's really pretty small. And there's a lot of work that's being done on thinking about that carbon budget and how we can stay within it. And one way that people are looking at this is the idea of stabilization wedges. That climate change is different from many of the other environmental issues that humanity is faced, and that we've got lots of options. It's not going to be one killer option that's going to fix this problem, but it's lots of small options. And I'm not going to go through this long list, but there's lots of options that individually would contribute. And so we can work in lots of different dimensions to try and reduce our fossil fuel emissions. And it doesn't mean that we fundamentally have to change societies. It means we have to place emphasis in different areas. Electric cars look almost exactly like a regular car. They just don't have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So there's a lot we can do. A lot of this is around energy efficiency. And so this is one of the many, many, many figures out there of high emissions, low emissions, and the major ways that we can try and reduce emissions: increasing energy efficiency, overall reduction of emissions, and switching to renewables. Did any of you see this? Do you know what that is? It's a solar farm. China is putting in huge numbers of solar farms right now. They are completely switching their economy to solar. And they're China, so they're doing it in these adorable ways. We would just put in a solar farm. I don't think we would think of having a panda out there. I think this is great. But we're seeing fundamental changes go on in many countries. So we're seeing real switches to renewables because they make sense. And one of the switches is that when you look at many of these mitigation policies and technologies, almost all of them have health co-benefits. This is lovely work that Alistair did. Not only is the work excellent, but that photograph is just amazing. And so this is looking just in New Zealand of just shifting 5% of urban car trips. You can save fuel, you can save a lot of lives, you can save a lot in healthcare costs, acknowledging that you will have extra road crash deaths. But when you think about how many people die in road accidents, you have these really significant benefits. And we know that getting people out of cars, walking and biking improves your health. And so when you look across the work that's been done on what are called the health co-benefits of mitigation policies, that most of the studies say that these mitigation policies are offset, sometimes completely, by the health benefits. And the health benefits are now. So if people don't become obese, if they don't become hypertensive, or if they are obese and hypertensive, if they reduce that, it really improves the quality of their life, it improves their productivity, it makes their lives better, and it does it now. So when you read that the cost of mitigation, for example, one estimate for Paris is mitigation could cost 3% of GDP, what people are not saying is we could have healthier lives if we did that, and we'd save a lot of money in healthcare costs, and we'd save a lot of suffering that people have. So this is another silver lining. It's a really good news story that promoting mitigation will be good for all of us. And we should be doing it for our health anyway. And with that, thank you for listening.